The heavy, rhythmic, mechanical thud of the windshield wipers aggressively clearing the freezing rain from the glass was the absolute only sound inside the cab of my F-250 work truck. It was 2,300 hours on a Tuesday night. The ambient exterior temperature was currently hovering just a fraction of a degree above freezing, turning the heavy downpour into a dangerous, icy slush on the asphalt. My name is Cameron Nelson. I am 29 years old, and I am an industrial electrician. I do not wear tailored Italian suits, I do not attend high society networking mixers, and I do not negotiate multi-million-dollar corporate mergers. I wear heavy, flame-resistant canvas work jackets. I pull thick, heavy-gauge copper wire through rigid steel conduit, and I ensure that massive, high-voltage systems do not arc, violently explode, and burn commercial buildings to the ground. I am an entirely ordinary, functional component of the city's blue-collar infrastructure. I was currently gripping the leather steering wheel, navigating the slick, poorly lit suburban roads because my younger sister, Clara, had called my cell phone 30 minutes prior in a state of absolute, frantic panic. Clara is a junior assistant event coordinator. Her primary vehicle, a highly unreliable, 10-year-old sedan, had just suffered a catastrophic transmission failure on the outer loop of the highway, completely stranding her and her executive boss on the shoulder after a grueling 14-hour municipal site inspection. I checked my side mirrors, activated my turn signal, and pulled the heavy truck onto the muddy, uneven shoulder directly behind Clara's dead sedan. The hazard lights of her car were flashing weakly in the heavy downpour, reflecting dimly off the wet, black asphalt. I threw the truck into park, leaving the diesel engine idling. Clara immediately sprinted through the freezing rain, her boots splashing loudly in the deep puddles, and aggressively yanked open the heavy passenger door of my truck, scrambling into the warm cab. She was completely soaked, shivering violently in her thin, entirely inadequate autumn jacket. "Cameron, you are an absolute lifesaver," Clara gasped, desperately wiping wet, tangled hair out of her eyes. The municipal tow truck dispatcher said it would be a minimum of 3 hours before they could reach us. "We are literally freezing to death out here." She didn't wait for my response. She immediately turned back toward the open door, facing the dark sedan, and waved frantically into the storm. A second woman emerged from the passenger side of the broken car and walked steadily through the driving rain. She did not sprint. She did not hunch her shoulders against the cold. Even in the freezing, miserable downpour, she moved with a measured, deliberate, highly polished grace. She climbed up into the elevated cab of the truck, taking the middle seat directly next to Clara, bringing the sharp, clean scent of cold rain and faint, expensive vanilla into the enclosed space. Audrey Wright was 36 years old. She was the lead executive director for Vanguard Events, a prominent firm specializing in high-profile, high-net-worth charity galas. She wore a sharp, tailored black trench coat that was currently being ruined by the weather, and her dark, elegant hair was plastered flat against her pale cheeks. She looked profoundly, systemically exhausted, carrying a heavy, invisible weight that clearly had absolutely nothing to do with the mechanical failure of the car. "Mr. Nelson," Audrey said, her voice incredibly smooth but tight with the biting cold, "I apologize for the immense inconvenience this has caused you. Clara insisted you wouldn't mind coming out this far." "It is not an inconvenience," I replied plainly, my voice a rough, tired gravel that lacked any sort of charming inflection. I reached over to the center console and turned the analog heater dial to its maximum output, the industrial vents roaring to life and blasting hot air into the cab. "I have heavy-duty jumper cables in the toolbox, but a drop transmission requires a commercial flatbed tow. Give me your residential address. I will drive you home safely." I safely merged the heavy truck back onto the slick highway and dropped Clara off at her apartment complex first. She talked rapidly the entire way, filling the cab with chaotic, nervous energy regarding the massive logistics of an upcoming charity gala. Audrey remained entirely silent beside her, staring blankly out the rain-streaked passenger window, her posture rigidly controlled. After Clara thanked me and exited the vehicle, I pulled back onto the road. The silence in the truck cab immediately became heavy, distinct, and absolute. I am not a man who initiates charming, effortless small talk to fill quiet spaces. I do not possess that specific social fluency. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the slick asphalt, carefully monitoring the braking distance of the vehicles ahead in the icy conditions. 20 minutes later, navigating through a wealthy, heavily manicured suburb, I pulled up to the quiet curb outside Audrey's upscale, gated townhouse complex. I depressed the heavy brake pedal and shifted the column shifter into park. The large diesel engine idled with a low, steady, vibrating rumble. Audrey did not move. She sat completely still in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the illuminated dashboard dials. She reached into her damp coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. The bright screen flared, harshly illuminating her pale face, highlighting a rigidly color-coded production schedule filled with dozens of overlapping red alerts and unread emails. She stared at the screen for exactly 2 seconds, her breathing becoming noticeably shallow, before immediately pressing the sleep button. Actively unable to cognitively process the data, her hands dropped heavily back into her lap. She never unbuckled her seatbelt. I waited in absolute silence for 60 seconds. I do not push people. I do not pry into closed systems. We are at the correct coordinates, I noted quietly, keeping my hands resting loosely on the bottom of the steering wheel. Audrey blinked rapidly, seemingly pulling herself back from a very dark, incredibly distant mental space. She slowly turned her head to look over at me, her eyes red-rimmed and heavily bruised with deep fatigue. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly in the quiet cab. She still didn't reach for the buckle. I don't want to go inside yet. It's incredibly quiet in there." "It's too quiet." I looked down at her hands, resting on the fabric of her coat. The harsh light from the street lamp caught her left hand. I noticed a distinct, pale ring mark on her fourth finger. It was a recent physical subtraction. The skin had not yet tanned to match the rest of her hand, leaving a stark white band. The heavy, crushing weight she was carrying suddenly made mechanical sense. The foundation of her personal life had fractured. "We're just friends of Clara's," I stated, my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of expectation, establishing a perfectly safe, unyielding boundary. "I am an electrician. I am an ordinary guy. I do not require you to entertain me with conversation. You do not have to speak or explain anything. You can simply sit here, while the heater runs until you are fully ready to walk to your door." Audrey stared at me. She studied the dirty, grease-stained canvas of my work jacket and the heavy, calloused lines of my hands resting on the wheel. She searched my face for any sign of pity, judgment, or an ulterior motive. She saw only the absolute lack of expectation in my posture. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her rigid shoulders physically dropping 2 inches as the defensive tension released. "Thank you, Cameron," she breathed, leaning her head back against the headrest. We sat in the idling truck for exactly 45 minutes. The only sound in the world was the heavy, rhythmic rain hitting the metal roof and the low, comforting hum of the diesel engine. I noticed she subconsciously tapped her thumb against her phone case every few minutes, a residual habit of a mind that couldn't completely turn off the work sequence, but she never turned the screen back on. I did not ask probing questions. I did not offer unearned, amateur emotional advice. I simply provided a warm, secure, and entirely undemanding physical perimeter. When she finally reached over and pressed the red button to unbuckle her seatbelt, she looked significantly more grounded. The frantic edge of the panic had receded from her eyes, replaced by her usual sharp intelligence. "I have a massive charity gala scheduled for Saturday night at the Grand Horizon Hall," Audrey said softly, opening the heavy truck door, letting the cold air rush in. "It's the most important, highly publicized event of my career. My primary lighting and power vendor just defaulted on their contract this morning due to a staffing shortage. Clara mentioned to me last week that you work extensively with commercial power grids. I handle high-voltage routing, industrial load balancing, and structural event illumination," I confirmed, turning my head to look at her. "The venue requires a massive, temporary power drop to safely run the extensive stage lighting and catering prep lines," she explained, stepping out into the cold night air, pulling her coat tight. "I don't need a slick corporate presentation. I need someone incredibly reliable. I need someone who actually shows up when things break. I show up," I promised simply, the vow carrying the full weight of my character. "I will instruct Clara to send you the formal vendor contract and the power schematics tomorrow morning," Audrey said. She offered a small, exhausted, but entirely genuine smile that briefly illuminated her face. "Good night, Cameron, and thank you for the quiet." Good night. The next evening, Wednesday at 1,800 hours, I arrived at the Grand Horizon Event Hall for the initial site survey. The building was a sprawling, cavernous, aging architectural monolith from the 1920s. It featured massive, vaulted, plaster ceilings, beautifully tarnished brass chandeliers, and an outdated, highly compromised electrical infrastructure that made me instantly wary. The main ballroom was a chaotic hive of preliminary activity. Union caterers were aggressively setting up prep tables, and heavy rigging crews were loudly erecting massive aluminum metal trusses. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors, wearing my thick leather tool belt and a highly visible neon work shirt. I carried a thick, heavy coil of heavy-gauge copper grounding wire on my right shoulder. Audrey was standing near the exact center of the chaotic room, holding a digital tablet, directing a specialized crew of florists with precise, flawlessly calm commands. She looked sharp, professional, and entirely in command of her operational environment. She saw me enter the room and walked over immediately, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "You're exactly on time," she noted, her tone purely professional, entirely bypassing our quiet moment in the truck. "Timeliness is a basic, required metric of the trade," I replied, setting the heavy coil of copper wire down onto the floor with a solid, echoing thud. "I reviewed the schematics," Clara sent. "The required phase loads for your lighting rig are immense. Where's the primary service junction box located?" Audrey pointed a pen toward a set of heavy, gray metal doors near the rear of the staging area. The venue management stated the main 400 amp breaker panel is in that utility closet. We need to safely pull 3 separate 220-volt temporary lines to the overhead trusses. Before I could nod and walk toward the closet to begin my inspection, a man stepped out from behind the heavy velvet stage curtains. He wore an impeccably tailored, highly expensive charcoal suit. He moved with a slick, incredibly arrogant, predatory confidence. Audrey stiffened instantly. Her spine snapped completely rigid. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale. Her knuckles turned white as her hands clenched tightly around the thin edges of her tablet. "Marcus," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, strictly defensive register. "Audrey, darling." Marcus Vance smiled smoothly, coming to a stop exactly 3 feet away from her. He entirely ignored my presence, treating me like a piece of the venue's furniture. He reached out and slowly, intentionally traced his index finger along the top edge of her digital tablet, then tapped the screen, causing it to wake up. It was a highly subtle, calculated physical invasion of her personal workspace, designed to assert dominance. "You shouldn't be here," Audrey stated, immediately pulling the tablet back against her chest, holding her ground, though I could clearly see the subtle, uncontrollable tremor in her fingers. "I bought the controlling interest in this building last month, Audrey," Vance corrected, a cold, condescending edge bleeding into his charming tone. "I am the owner. I can be wherever I please. I heard your primary lighting vendor abruptly pulled out. That's a massive logistical failure on your part. It would be an absolute tragedy if this charity gala fell apart and completely ruined your independent firm's reputation in this city." He stepped a fraction of an inch closer, entirely invading her personal space, lowering his voice. "You don't have to struggle out here on your own like this," Vance murmured, his voice adopting a sickeningly sweet tone. "Cancel the event. Come back to the firm. Come back to me. I can make all of this operational stress miraculously disappear. You just have to admit you need me." The pale ring mark on Audrey's left hand suddenly made complete, horrifying sense. Vance was the ex-fiancé, and he was actively, maliciously weaponizing his ownership of the venue to deliberately force a professional failure, attempting to extort her back into a toxic relationship through sheer logistical pressure and sabotage. I do not involve myself in civilian emotional drama, but I absolutely do not tolerate predatory behavior or bullying in my immediate operational zone. I stepped smoothly and decisively between Audrey and Vance. I did not shout. I did not puff out my chest or attempt to posture like an alpha male. I simply utilized my large physical size and my heavy, rigid canvas work clothes to establish an immediate, unyielding physical boundary. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a flat, deadpan rumble that forced Vance to either step back immediately or physically collide with my chest. "I require clear, unobstructed access to the utility closet to inspect the primary service panel." Vance glared up at me, his arrogant, controlling smile vanishing instantly. He looked at my worn tool belt, my grease-stained hands, and my dirty work boots with overt, upper-class disdain. "Who the hell are you?" "I am the formally contracted electrical vendor for this event," I replied, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. I did not blink. You are currently standing directly in my required path of travel. Vance's jaw tightened visibly. He looked past my broad shoulder at Audrey, attempting to re-establish his dominance. You're hiring random day laborers off the street now? This venue explicitly requires certified union professionals, Audrey. If his work isn't fully compliant with municipal code, I will personally call the fire marshal and shut this entire event down for safety violations. My state-issued journeyman license number is stamped in highly visible lettering on the side of my truck outside, I stated quietly, refusing to engage in an emotional posturing contest. I will ensure the system is entirely compliant. Now, move. Vance sneered, realizing he had entirely lost the immediate physical intimidation angle in front of his ex-fiancée. He adjusted his expensive tie, turned sharply on his heel, and walked away, disappearing through the main exit doors. The heavy, suffocating tension in the room slowly dissipated. Audrey let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing the heels of her hands firmly against her eyes to stop the tears of pure frustration. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. "He bought this building specifically because he knew I had this gala booked here 6 months ago. He's trying to slowly squeeze my logistics until I break and go back to him." I looked at the heavy metal doors of the utility closet. I looked at the profound exhaustion lining her beautiful face. He is utilizing environmental control to engineer a failure. I analyzed plainly, stating the facts. It is a coward's tactic. Audrey dropped her hands, looking at me with a faint, deeply surprised expression. "You didn't ask me what happened. You didn't ask why we broke up or what he did. The historical data of your relationship is entirely irrelevant to the current mechanical task," I replied, picking up my heavy coil of copper wire. "He is an active hazard. I am here to safely wire the lights. I will not let him near the electrical panel while my team is operating." For the next 2 days, I essentially existed inside the venue. I worked a grueling 12-hour shift at my primary industrial job in the city, then drove directly to the Grand Horizon Hall to work until 2 in the morning. The electrical infrastructure of the aging building was a nightmare of severely degraded wiring, corroded bus bars, and outdated fuses. I methodically pulled heavy-gauge copper through the dusty, cramped ceiling conduits, carefully calculating and balancing the intense phase loads required to power the massive stage lights without tripping the fragile main breakers. Audrey was always there. She managed the frantic caterers, the demanding florists, and the highly anxious charity board members with a brilliant, relentless efficiency. Despite the absolute chaos of the massive production, she always found time to bring me a hot black coffee or a cold bottle of water. She didn't ask me to engage in witty banter. We operated in a deeply comfortable, highly functional parallel silence, securely bound by the shared objective of ensuring the event did not fail. On Friday night at 2,300 hours, disaster struck. I was standing on the platform of a hydraulic scissor lift, 20 feet in the air near the ceiling, tightly securing a heavy aluminum lighting truss. Audrey was standing directly below me on the ballroom floor, reviewing a clipboard schedule. Suddenly, with a loud mechanical pop that echoed through the hall, the entire ballroom plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The heavy, continuous hum of the massive industrial HVAC system died instantly. A sharp, panicked gasp escaped Audrey's lips in the sudden darkness. I immediately pulled my heavy-duty, high-lumen tactical flashlight from my belt pouch and clicked it on. I swept the brilliant white beam across the room, illuminating Audrey. She was frozen in place, her hands gripping the edges of the clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white. "Do not move," I commanded, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden, eerie silence. "The primary service breaker just tripped. I'm coming down." I manually engaged the emergency pressure release valve on the lift, smoothly lowering the platform to the ground. I hit the floor and walked rapidly toward the utility closet, keeping the bright beam of light focused strictly on the path to ensure she didn't trip over any cables. Audrey followed closely behind me, utilizing my large physical presence as a reliable guide in the dark. I reached the utility room. The heavy metal door, which I had securely locked earlier, was slightly ajar. The padlock had been cut. I pushed the door wide open and swept the light across the massive, gray electrical panel mounted on the concrete wall. The heavy steel dead front cover had been completely removed and tossed carelessly aside onto the floor. The main 400 amp breaker switch was firmly locked in the off position. But it hadn't simply tripped due to a thermal overload. I stepped closer, aiming the focused beam of light directly at the heavy, thick copper feed lines entering the top of the panel. Someone had taken a pair of heavy industrial bolt cutters and physically severed the primary neutral wire completely in half. The freshly cut ends of the heavy copper were violently bright against the surrounding grime, and the confined room smelled faintly of freshly sheared metal and the sharp tang of ozone. "What happened?" Audrey asked, her voice trembling in the dark hallway behind me. "Did we overload the system?" "No," I stated, my voice dropping to a harsh, incredibly cold gravel. I pointed the intense beam of light directly at the severed line. This was an intentional, physical act of sabotage. Audrey stepped slowly into the utility room, looking at the cleanly cut wire in the beam of my flashlight. "Vance," she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow to the stomach. "He engineered a critical system failure," I confirmed, my jaw locking tight with anger. "The gala is tomorrow night," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking entirely. She leaned heavily against the cold concrete wall, sliding slowly down until she was sitting on the dusty floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The fierce resilience she had maintained all week finally shattered. "It's over. The union caterers need power by 6 a.m. to start the prep line. The band needs power for a full sound check at noon. We can't run a luxury event for 500 wealthy donors in the dark." He won. He actually won. I looked down at her sitting in the dirt and the dark. I watched the brilliant, highly capable woman breaking down under the immense weight of a maliciously engineered failure. I do not possess the poetic vocabulary for complex emotional comfort, but I possess a state-issued industrial electrical license, and I know exactly how to safely navigate and bypass broken systems. "The event is not over," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute certainty in the small concrete room. Audrey looked up at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the harsh glare of the flashlight. "Cameron, the main service feed line is physically severed. You can't just tape that back together. Fixing a 400 amp main requires the utility company to come out and shut off the entire grid block, a formal municipal permit, and a commercial repair crew. No one will come out here on a Friday night to pull a permit." "You are absolutely correct. I cannot legally splice a severed main service feed inside the panel without utility authorization," I told her, stepping firmly into her space, my voice taking on a heavy, commanding authority. "But the municipal code has emergency stabilization provisions. I will formally file the incident report and the temporary event permit application first thing in the morning." "What does that mean for tonight?" she argued weakly, shaking her head. "He'll call the inspector tomorrow morning and have the event shut down for illegal wiring. It means I am not going to fix his broken panel. I am going to completely bypass it," I countered, my voice flat and entirely devoid of fear. "I am going to electrically isolate this damaged panel by pulling the main fuses. I have a temporary, high-amperage event distribution box in the back of my truck. We will run heavy camlock cables straight from the secondary utility main drop in the exterior alley, bypassing the building's infrastructure entirely, directly to spider boxes for your stage and catering lines. It is standard, legally approved, permitted event power protocol." I crouched down in front of her, bringing my eye level down to hers. I did not reach out to touch her. I maintained my respectful distance, allowing the calm logic of the plan to ground her. "Vance committed a felony by intentionally severing a live commercial feed," I noted. "If he calls the inspector tomorrow, I will demand a forensic review of the cut marks on the copper, and I will point the police directly toward his master keys. I will restore the power. You will host your gala tomorrow night. Do you trust me?" Audrey stared at me. She searched the rigid lines of my face for any sign of hesitation or bravado. She found only the raw, undeniable competence of a man who fully understood his trade. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Then stand up," I instructed gently, handing her the heavy flashlight. "I need you to hold the light." For the next 4 hours, we existed in a state of intense, hyper-focused synchronization. It was a profoundly intimate form of collaboration, entirely devoid of romance but thick with mutual reliance. I worked with heavy, insulated tools. We went out into the freezing rain in the alley. I killed the upstream secondary breaker on the utility pole, snapped a bright red lockout tag onto the switch to prevent accidental re-engagement, and verified the line was completely dead with my multimeter. I hauled the incredibly heavy 150-pound distribution box from my truck bed and ran the thick, black 4/0 cam lock cables through the loading dock doors, taping them securely to the floor to prevent trip hazards, patching them safely into the secondary grid. Audrey stood beside me the entire time. She didn't complain about the biting cold or the dark. She held the heavy flashlight perfectly steady, anticipating my specific movements, illuminating the exact quadrant of the gear I needed to see before I even asked. She was a flawless operational partner. At 0300 hours on Saturday morning, I stepped back from the temporary distribution box inside the ballroom. My arms and shoulders were deeply aching from the sustained physical exertion of wrestling with the heavy gauge wire. "The temporary tie-in is complete," I announced, wiping the sweat and rainwater from my eyes. "The circuit is mechanically and electrically sound." "Are you sure?" Audrey asked, her voice tense. "I do not make assumptions with high voltage," I replied. "Clear the immediate area." She stepped back. I engaged my thick rubber safety gloves, reached out, and forcefully threw the main breaker on the distribution box into the on position. A loud, heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the temporary panel. Instantly, the massive overhead chandeliers and stage lights in the ballroom flared to life, flooding the space with brilliant, warm light. The heavy hum of the industrial HVAC system kicked on, pushing warm air through the massive vents. The perimeter was secured. The power was restored. Audrey walked slowly back toward me. She looked at the humming distribution box, then looked at my tired face. The sheer, overwhelming relief radiating from her posture was profound. She didn't offer a polite, formal thank you. She closed the physical gap entirely, stepping directly into my guarded personal space. She reached up, wrapped her arms securely around my neck, and buried her face against my heavy, dirty, wet canvas work jacket, holding onto me with fierce strength. My central nervous system short-circuited. I froze. My large hands hovered awkwardly in the empty air. "You fixed it," she murmured against my chest, her voice warm, the vibration transferring directly into my chest cavity. The complex logic of the situation clicked into place. She wasn't an unpredictable variable. She was a brilliant person who simply needed a solid foundation. I lowered my arms. I wrapped them carefully around her waist, pulling her gently against me, resting my chin on the top of her head. The physical contact felt deeply. "The system is functional," I whispered, my voice rough. Saturday night, 2,000 hours. The charity gala was a massive, undeniable success. The Grand Horizon Hall looked spectacular. 500 wealthy donors filled the room. The custom event power I had meticulously wired functioned flawlessly, casting a warm, elegant glow over the entire event. I did not wear my work clothes. Clara had aggressively insisted I attend the event. I wore a simple, dark suit I had purchased years ago. I stood near the rear exit doors, holding a glass of sparkling water, gripping the thin glass tightly to ground myself. I quietly observed the room, specifically watching the load capacity of the temporary lighting grid. Vance was not present. I had sent him a highly detailed photograph of the severed wire and the bolt cutters I found in the alley, accompanied by a simple text message. "The municipal inspector and the police will receive this image if you breach this perimeter tonight." He did not show up. At 2,200 hours, the formal speech is concluded. The crowd began to migrate toward the dance floor. Audrey broke away from a group of major donors and walked directly toward me. She wore a stunning, deep crimson evening gown. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely out of my league. "You're hiding by the exit," she noted, stopping exactly 2 feet away, her eyes shining with triumph. "I am observing the load capacity of the trusses," I noted smoothly, gesturing slightly toward the ceiling. "It is holding steady. The event raised $2 million, she said, her voice dropping the performative, public tone she had been using with the guests. "It's the most successful gala in the firm's history." "The required parameters were met," I confirmed. She turned to face me, her back to the crowded room. She looked up into my face, her dark eyes studying the rough lines of my jaw. The polished event director persona fractured slightly, revealing the intense exhaustion she had been actively suppressing all night. She stepped a fraction of an inch closer. The physical proximity was overwhelming. I looked down at her hand resting near her side. The pale ring mark on her finger was still faintly visible, but she wasn't hiding it in her coat pocket anymore. I took a slow breath, loosening my tight grip on the water glass. "I am an ordinary guy, Audrey," I admitted, my voice a rough, quiet rumble in the loud room. Finally stripping away the stoic armor I wore to survive. I don't know how to navigate this environment. I'm profoundly out of my element here. I prefer men who are out of their element, she promised, reaching up and lightly, intentionally touching the lapel of my cheap suit jacket. It was a microscopic touch, but it sent a distinct, heavy shock through my system. And I have an invitation I can't explain. What invitation? I asked, my heart hammering a rapid rhythm against my ribs. To stay and help me close down the venue after everyone leaves, she whispered. Her eyes locked fiercely onto mine. Just us. I looked at the fierce intelligence and the undeniable strength that defined her. I realized I didn't need to be perfectly smooth or wealthy. I just needed to be exactly who I was. I am exceptionally good at shutting systems down safely, I replied, leaning closer. Good, she breathed, her hand sliding from my lapel to rest lightly against my chest. Then start with me. Don't leave yet. The end.